Hey everyone, thank you for joining us for the mobile photography webinar with David Newton. Clearly mobile is becoming the best way to capture the memories in the moment. So why not take the best photos with your handy phone, right? So I want to take a moment and thank our partners LG for all the wonderful support for the program. You're actually going to be seeing some of the most beautiful photos taken on their flagship LG V10 in our webinar today. So that's very exciting. All right, so we have a packed house today and we really appreciate you attending our event. My name is Sai and I'll be your host for the presentation. So some quick housekeeping items before we move ahead. On your screen to the left is the GoToWebinar viewer through which you will see the presentation. To the right is the GoToWebinar control panel where you can select an audio mode and ask questions. Our presentation today will last for about 40 minutes, after which will be open for Q&A. As we go through the webinar, please leave us your questions in the questions box you see on your control panel, and we will answer as many as we can at the end of the presentation. So, last but not the least, this webinar will be recorded. I know a lot of people had questions, but we recorded and sent to you via email in 48 hours. With the housekeeping items aside, let's move on to the webinar. We're privileged to have David Newton with us today. A lot of you guys have seen David's best photos on our communication. So David has coupled his love for nature and photography quite well, and recently has taken it to the smartphone. And boy, does he have some good photos. Today he will share all the top tips so we can snap like a pro too. I love that. So with no further ado, I'll hand it to David, who will take us through the presentation.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the introduction, Sai. As you can all hear, my accent is not American. I am indeed a Brit, and yes, I'm in England. That does mean that the sound you may possibly be able to hear in the background is rain. I hope it's not too distracting. It does rain here, unfortunately, quite a lot, but hopefully you'll be able to hear. Everything that I've got to say. So, as Sai said, this is a mobile photography webinar. I want to give you some advice, some tips, some information on how to get great photos with your mobile phone. I've got a whole list of things I want to talk to you about. One of which is I'm going to talk to you about the EPIC initiative, which is an initiative that SanDisk have started, and it stands for Extreme Photo Imaging Capability. And really, it's about trying to take a holistic view towards mobile phone imaging. They're trying to push mobile phone manufacturers to look at more than just the sensor, but also look at everything that's involved in taking an image to give you the best possible image quality and experience in taking pictures. So, as I say, moving on, I've got a couple of things that I want to talk to you about. 6 key things that we told you about in pre-communication. I'm going to talk to you about natural or artificial light, or otherwise the basis of photography. We will talk some about composition and some basic compositional tips and techniques that you can use to get great pictures, to turn your snaps into something a bit more interesting to look at. I'm going to tell you a bit about RAW and JPEG and about the benefits of RAW over JPEG. We'll talk about long exposure, how to get those beautiful, dreamy long exposure images. Yes, I'll talk about selfies and groupies. I know everyone takes selfies and groupies, so no mobile photography webinar would be complete without at least a brief mention of them. And then I'm going to give you some of the big no-nos, some of the things that you really want to be avoiding when shooting with a mobile phone. But there will also be a few other tips as well, so don't think you're only going to get those 6 things. There's going to be a few more tidbits that I'll chuck in as we go. And I'm actually going to start off not at the top, but with one of those tips. Now, if you ask anyone who knows about photography, even those that don't know about photography, what makes a professional-looking picture? One of the things that people will tell you is that it's to do with the out-of-focus background. People like out-of-focus background. And this is something that people always struggle with mobile phones. They always say, oh, but the mobile phone, the sensor's very small, we don't have an aperture, we can't get shallow depth of field. Well, actually, we can, because the biggest control over depth of field is actually not the aperture. Yes, aperture is important, but the biggest control over depth of field is actually subject distance. So we take, for example, this image here. We've got this rock in the foreground, and we've got some nice out-of-focusness going on in the background. It's caused, this out of focus background is caused by getting in really close to your subject. Now, if you're a long way back, you have a lot of depth of field. So there's a lot of focus or definition from the foreground all the way through to the background. As you get in close to your subject, that depth of field will reduce and reduce and reduce, and you'll be able to get a shallow depth of field effect even with a mobile phone. Give you another example. It's springtime here. One of the pleasures of the rain in Britain is, of course, that it causes the flowers to bloom. And we've now got daffodils blooming. This was only taken yesterday. Thousands of these daffodils are coming up in beautiful carpets all over the place. And here you can see, by getting in close to the flower in the foreground, I've managed to make the background go into this lovely wash of green and yellow. So you can still see that it's part of a much bigger carpet of daffodils, but you don't see all of them. So remember that when you're taking pictures. Remember to control your depth of field. Don't think you have no control of your depth of field, but remember that you can get in close to your subject and you can help bring that depth of field down, get you those shallow depth of field effects. Okay, so moving back to the beginning of photography. Well, photography is all about light. So we need to talk about light and exposure. Now, light, as I say, it's the basis of photography. Without photography, we have no light. Oh, sorry, without light, we have no photography. And for the Greek scholars among you, you will know that photography comes from two Greek words, photographos. That means painting or drawing with light. And you should think about that every time you want to take a picture. Think about the light. Where's it coming from? What kind of light is it? So here we have a sunset, and we know that sunsets give us beautiful golden tones. We get these lovely oranges and golds as the sun goes down below the horizon. It's a great time to shoot landscapes because you get lovely low light, it's soft, you've got the beautiful colors. It really can bring out texture and detail in images, in scenes. So you get much more alluring, much more inviting pictures that people want to look at longer. If you're good at getting up in the morning, then sunrise is also a fabulous time for landscapes. Here we tend to find that the colors, we tend to have less gold, more kind of pinks and reds, although it does slightly depend on where you are in the world. This was taken early in the morning in Norway a few weeks ago. It was pretty chilly. You'll see a few more Norway pictures as we go. And as you can see, you know, a lovely sunrise shooting into the rising sun. This would traditionally be quite a challenging shot for a mobile phone. In fact, it would be a fairly challenging shot for most cameras because of the contrast range between the bright sky and the dark foreground. But something I'll talk about a little later on is the use of ND filters. And here, treating a mobile phone like a traditional camera, using filters to help control that dynamic range, to help control the contrast. So these two images are natural light. So they're light basically from the sun. But how about when you've got artificial light, as we do here? This is obviously the Bellagio in Las Vegas, very famous for its fountains. Now in this case, we don't have a lot of control over the light that's there. It's, you know, the light's coming from the hotel, from the strip, and from the fountains. And it's not like we can pop into the hotel and say to the concierge, excuse me, would you mind turning on some more lights or turning off some lights? It's a bit more reactive. We have to respond to the light that we see in front of us. So in this instance, our creativity is controlled more about where we shoot from and what we want to show. I'll give you another example. Here is some jellyfish. Now these haven't been diving for a while, unfortunately. These were taken in an aquarium. It's the sort of picture that anyone could take. And nicely, at the aquarium where these were taken, they've lit the jellyfish from the side. So they've paid attention to their display as to where the light is coming from to really bring out the detail of the translucent jellyfish. So they fire the light in from the side and from behind, and they've left the background go dark. So the jellyfish really stand out. And if you take this approach when you're looking at artificial light, you think about where the light comes from. Is it coming from above? If you're photographing people, that's usually not the best place to have light coming from. Is it from the side or from behind? Or is it coming straight onto the face? Then it's something that you can think about before taking your pictures to try and make sure the light is in the right place to show what you want to show. You know, if you take pictures of people, for example, and the light's coming from directly above, they'll have shadows all over their face, under their eyes, under their nose. It never really works that nicely. So paying attention to the light is absolutely crucial. Now, if you've got the light direction sorted, we now need to start thinking about how we record the light, how the camera records the light. And the thing to say about cameras, and it doesn't matter whether they're mobile phone cameras or whether they're traditional cameras, cameras are dumb. They can't tell the difference between shadows and highlights. They think that everything is a mid-tone grey. So a mid-tone grey being kind of the grey in the middle of this histogram here. Now, I'm sure those of you that are familiar with photography have possibly seen this. When we're taking a picture, a camera wants to make everything mid-tone grey. It wants to make whites grey and it wants to make blacks grey. It doesn't know the difference between the extremes. Now, mobile phone cameras give us the ability, certainly some of the newer ones like the LG V10, give us the ability to see a live histogram. Now, I know many people get very scared by histograms, but it's really just a bar graph. If you look at the bottom here, you can see we've got the blacks, the shadows, the midtones, the highlights, and the whites up on the right-hand end. And above it, we've got a whole series of bars. Anytime that there is a bar at any particular brightness level, that's telling you there is a certain number of pixels at that brightness. And you can see this live when you're taking a picture. Now, what we want to avoid is anything on the far right-hand end, anything where we've got a whole load of pixels bunched up on the far right-hand end, or anything really bunched up down on the bottom left. But beyond that, there are no rules. And this is something that I'll talk about repeatedly, is about the lack of rules in photography. We hear people talk about photography and there are all these rules, and people will tell you with a histogram that your ideal shape would be a nice bell curve distribution in the middle. Well, unfortunately, that doesn't ever really happen. Now, using the histogram is actually a great tool to helping you get the correct exposure. As I say, you can see what the image is going to look like far better than you can when you look on the screen. So we can pose on the screen of a phone, and depending on your brightness setting of the screen will depend on exactly how, obviously, bright or dark the picture looks. Now, if you've got your screen brightness turned all the way up, you may make the image darker than it needs to be because the phone or the screen itself is artificially lightening it. Equally, if you've got the screen brightness all the way down to conserve battery life, you may make the image overly bright because you're trying to compensate for a dark screen. So first up, remember to look at your screen brightness. But even so, if you've got the ability to view a histogram, you should try and view it to give you that idea as, is anything going to be overexposed on the highlight end, or is anything going to be underexposed on the shadow end? Use that as your basis for setting the exposure. Now, from a mobile phone point of view, we've got two things that we can use to adjust exposure. We've got ISO, which is the sensitivity of the camera, and we've got now shutter speed. We've got these manual controls that phones like the V10 give us. So we can use a fast shutter speed, maybe for freezing motion, or a slow shutter speed for bringing in some blur, and we can use low ISOs, which generally give us nicer looking images with less image noise, or we can use very high ISOs in low light conditions to help us record a bit more light. So that's your histogram. Useful to use. Now, next up, one of the things you find when you're photographing landscapes, I mentioned it briefly, is that you might end up with an image like this. I'm sure most people have taken a picture where you've got a sky that's overly bright compared to the rest of the image. It all feels a bit washed out. The foreground looks nice. We've got this lovely tuft of grass and the exposure in the foreground looks very nice, but the sky is all bright. There's no detail to it. It's all washed out. So I mentioned ND grads. This is a classic example of where using an ND filter would be very useful. So what is an ND filter? Well, ND stands for neutral density. And effectively, if you think about it like a pair of sunglasses for your lens, you basically position the sunglasses over the sky so that the sky gets darker, the foreground stays at the brightness level it is based on the exposure you've set, and you can then create an image where the exposure is balanced between the sky and the foreground. And I think you all agree that the image on the right looks a fair bit more appealing than the image on the left. All we've done is move towards using a traditional camera technique with a mobile phone. Now, yes, you can use HDR. Most mobile phones these days include an HDR mode, or high dynamic range, and these try to do the same thing as using filters. But in my experience, they never work quite as well. They always look a little bit artificial. And so for my personal preference, I try to avoid HDR wherever possible. Obviously, if you don't have filters, you don't have ND filters you can use with your phone, then it's a good stopgap. So yes, do make use of the HDR mode, but don't rely on it. Okay, now that's the science part of photography. Photography is it is part science and it's part creativity, or part art. And if you can get the science part sorted, you don't really have to think about it. You can spend more of your brain power working on the more creative aspects. So in this case, on composition. So let's start with composition. Now, as I said, there are an awful lot of rules about composition. One of the ones that I will talk about that you've probably heard of is called the rule of thirds. But you're going to find that we can go breaking those. So let's start with a very simple image. Here is a person walking up a snowy track, and the subject is right in the middle of the frame. You look at the picture and you think, okay, Dave, thanks for showing us that. It's not the most interesting picture, but it's instructive. Many people put their subject right in the middle of the frame. And as you can see, it rarely works very well. If we now skip on a little bit, a few seconds later, my subject has moved a little bit further up. I've hardly changed camera position, but my subject is now further towards the left of the frame. And what's happened is that the leading line of the track has become more dominant. And we know people tend to read images from left to right. They start on the left of the frame and they move to the right. So what's happening here, and what happens when you think about your composition, is you control exactly how the viewer sees the image. So you probably looked at the image from the left, you saw the hiker but passed beyond him, and you got to the right-hand corner. And then there was that strong black and white line leading you back in, dragging your eye back through to what I wanted you to look at, which is indeed the hiker and where he's going to. So simply by changing his position in the frame, I've changed how you look at the picture, and it's become a more interesting picture for you to look at. Okay, let's strip everything back. We've got a very simple image. It's sea and sky. And the classic mistake that people make with landscapes is that they put the horizon line right across the middle of the frame. Now, I'm not saying don't do it. It does work if you're shooting a reflection. If you want to get a lovely reflection between the horizon line into some water, by all means, put your horizon line across the middle. But if you're not looking for a reflection, the middle is not where you should be putting your horizon line. I've mentioned the rule of thirds. So if we overlay a third grid, we break our scene up into thirds both horizontally and vertically. And you'll see that this horizon line is now sitting just a little bit below that third, below the lower third. But the image doesn't feel unbalanced. We've got quite a lot of sky and we've got a little bit of water, but it doesn't feel like it's out of balance, like it feels awkward. It feels harmonious, and that's because of where that horizon line is. Now, the rule of thirds, the reason I get a bee in my bonnet about the rule of thirds is because people follow it incessantly. And the reality is, it is an approximation of something far more complex. So just use it as a guideline, think about your thirds, and we'll now look at a few more images where I can show you how it starts to work with more complex pictures. So here we're back in Norway, we've got a more complex image. We've actually got something, a subject, something in the foreground that I want you to look at. In this case, a rock. And then the mountains in the background. If we once again overlay our grid, we can see that the rock is sitting in that lower corner, the lower left-hand third. If I now overlay some circles, these points here where these thirds intersect are called cardinal points. Anything placed on or very close to those cardinal points will actually have more weight in the image. It has more visual dominance. The viewer becomes more aware of it. So you can control exactly how the viewer sees the scene. I'll give you another example. This is almost an exact mirror image. Here we've got a tuft of grass on the right-hand side this time rather than on the left. Now, why is it on the right-hand side? Well, if I'd placed it on the left, that prevailing wind blowing from right to left would have meant that your eye would have caught the grass and then been taken out off towards the left-hand edge, and you wouldn't have looked at the rest of the picture. If we overlay that grid once more, and indeed put on the cardinal points, you can see that the grass is cutting through that cardinal point. So your eye's come in from the left, you've drifted across the image, and now you're seeing the grass, and then it pushes you back in again. And you'll also notice that that top horizon line, the mountains in the distance, are again falling very close to that upper third. So there's a lot of structure to the picture. Beyond that, the lower third is also close to the twigs in the foreground. So you can see how we can start structuring images to make them more visually interesting. Okay, the light is important, but how you position subjects in the frame is also crucial. Now, it's not all landscapes. Yes, I do love shooting my landscapes, but it's not all landscapes. This is a ceiling in one of the hotels in Las Vegas, and the point here I want you to see is the rose. That's the important subject in the scene, is that you look at that rose. So again, it's positioned off to the left-hand edge on that left-hand third. See, if I overlay the grid lines again, we've got that left-hand third, and then the spars of the ceiling leading your eye back in from the right-hand side to stop you drifting out and off the picture. Now, I said we break rules. Even without me overlaying the grid lines here, you can see that nothing really is sitting on a third. The horizon at the top of the mountains is quite a way above the third. There's nothing in the lower third. And yet the image still looks interesting. And it's because I've used a very different technique. In this case, I've used a strong leading line. That being, I take the grids away, that being that sharp line of the snowdrift. You see, we've got the lit side, paying attention to the light, we've got the lit side on the right and the shaded side on the left. And by following that line through, your eye is automatically taken through towards the mountains in the distance. Okay, so you're getting a sense of place, a sense of scale, but I'm not rigidly conformed or constricted to that rule of thirds. I'll give you another example of breaking the rule. Here we have an image that is smack in the middle. But if you look carefully, look at where the horizon line is in the distance. It's falling reasonably close to that lower third. So we do actually still have a bit of a third thing going on, but still with the main subject, in this case the Wynn Hotel, sitting right in the middle of the frame. And the real thing about this image is, apart from it's such a dominant building on the skyline, that actually putting it in the middle seemed to make quite a bit of sense. But also we've got that strong color differential between the blue of the sky, because the sun had already gone down and the sky was getting a bit dark, versus the really rich golds and bronzes of the hotel, the Wynn and the Encore just behind it. So as I say, don't be rigidly stuck to your rule of thirds. It's not a rule, it's a guideline. Now a little bit different. Now we're looking at, instead of obeying those rules, we're using a nice receding spiral. So it's a classic shot of a staircase. You'll see many pictures of spiral staircases taken either from above or below, looking straight in the middle. And the reason is it's visually appealing. It causes your eye to follow the picture, to flow with the stairs, in this case from the top looking down, to the middle part at the bottom, which is actually what the subject is, even though there's no real subject there. The image still has a level of intrigue or mystery to it, because it makes you wonder, well, where are the stairs going? What's it leading to? And that's another trick that you can use when you're composing your pictures. Try and leave a bit of mystery, a bit of intrigue. What's going on here? What's going on there? Where's this picture going to lead me to? It makes viewers a bit more interested in what you're trying to show them. And finally, on composition, don't be afraid to use what we might call Dutch angles, otherwise known as having one leg longer than the other. Now, yes, it's true that by and large we want to try and avoid having wonky horizons. If you're photographing a picture of the sea, a nice sunset over the sea, and your horizon is wonky, then it's going to look like the sea is trying to drift out of the frame, and it's never that attractive. But when you've got something a bit more complex like this, we've got the tree. Obviously, it's Christmas time. We've got some Christmas lights, and we've got the Natural History Museum, which is a fabulous piece of architecture in central London. And I wanted to try and get the kind of the yellows of both the tree lights and the tungsten lights against that beautiful rich blue of the sky. And the only way I could really do it was to actually tilt the camera, get on a weird kind of angle, a Dutch angle, to try and get everything in as an appealing way as possible. So don't be afraid to break the rules, but at least know why you're breaking the rules, rather than just stumbling upon them by accident. So composition is something we could talk about ad infinitum. There are books and books and books on composition. Unfortunately, we have limited time, so I'm going to move on. If you've got questions about composition, please do remember to ask them towards the end. So let's move on and talk a little bit about RAW and JPEG. Now, for those of you that haven't shot with traditional cameras, the idea of RAW might be a little unfamiliar, so let me explain what they are. JPEG is a file type, obviously, that most people are familiar with. It's what most digital cameras would produce. They pretty much all produce a JPEG. But a RAW file is something that gives us a bit more control. So let me give you an analogy. For those of you that don't understand RAW, imagine that you are taking your son or daughter to one of their friends' birthday parties, and you have been tasked with bringing along a cake. You have two options. You either go to your local store and you buy some kind of ready-made cake, and you pull it out of the box, and maybe you can put a bit of squirty cream on top of it. Or you go to the store and you buy flour, eggs, sugar, chocolate icing, chocolate drops. You might get the idea that I quite like chocolate. All those good things that you might put into a cake, and then you go home and you bake something wonderful. Now, yes, I get that when you're baking a cake, it can go horribly wrong and you can end up with a flat cake. Fortunately, with a RAW file, you can always go back to where you started from. When you edit a RAW picture, it is non-destructive, so you can't ever end up in your flat cake scenario. So what are the differences? Well, RAW files, they tend to be much larger files. They contain more color data. JPEG files are smaller, they take up less space on your phone. RAW files certainly take up more space. To give you some figures around this, a JPEG file probably 4 or 5 megabytes, whereas a RAW file 20, 25, 30 megabytes, even 40 megabytes. We've seen some mobile phones producing 40 megabyte RAW files, and that's because of this extra color data that they provide. Now, JPEG files have a big advantage in sharing. If you're shooting just for social media, with a JPEG, you can share it instantly. You want to put it on Facebook, Twitter, whatever, you take the picture, it can be online in seconds, whereas a RAW file is going to require you to do something to it. You're going to have to process it. Now, most phones will shoot RAW in JPEG, in fact, so you've always got the JPEG that you can upload if you need to share quickly, or you want to share quickly, but it's the RAW file where you're going to get the best quality pictures. And to do your processing, you're going to probably want to use an app, something like maybe Adobe's Lightroom for Android, or indeed put it onto your computer, and there you could use any number of photo editing software. Now, one of the key advantages of RAW, beyond the extra color data and the extra color information you can capture, is that it's easier to remove image noise. Now, I mentioned ISO earlier on, which is the sensitivity of how much light the camera is going to record. When you turn the ISO up, so you go into a low light environment, the ISO goes up, you tend to end up with more image noise. It looks grainy and you get colored speckles, and a lot of the time you tend to want to avoid it. With a RAW file, we've got much more powerful tools to allow us to get rid of that noise, to get rid of the speckliness and make it look smoother. Now, you have to be careful about how far you go. Noise tends to appear first in shadow areas. If you get too heavy-handed with your noise removal, then you'll find that you'll start losing some of the fine detail in your images as well. So that's something you want to try and avoid, but it still gives you that extra control, extra ability to get smoother, better-looking images. Now, the one final thing to say about the difference between RAW and JPEG is to clear up a bit of confusion. There is no difference in resolution. If you have a 16 megapixel phone, or camera on your phone shoots 16 megapixels, If it's a JPEG or a RAW, it's still 16 megapixels. Shooting in RAW doesn't suddenly confer you more resolution. It's the same camera sensor. So the extra data is not coming from more resolution, it's coming from that, as I say, extra color data and extra information and ability to process the file afterwards. So I'll give you a bit of an example. Here's an image that is shot. If this had been shot as a JPEG, clearly it's very overexposed. Way too bright, there's no real detail in the highlights, all the colors are washed out. It's the sort of image that if you took that, you'd probably throw it away straight away. Now yes, a JPEG file we can edit, but every time we make edits to a JPEG file, we degrade its quality. We tend to find that the colors start blocking up and we lose some of the nice tonal gradation. But this was shot as a RAW file, and here is what we can do with it. This is very simple exposure and color and a little bit of contrast. So it gives you the ability to get something a bit more interesting, something that actually, instead of just binning it, we can get an image that is more pleasing to look at, that people may actually want to look at for longer. So that's where long exposure, not long exposure, sorry, it's where RAW shooting comes in. Talking of long exposures, if you want to get those really dreamy scenes, I'm a big fan of shooting with long exposures, doesn't matter what camera I'm using or what mobile phone. I love long exposures. So here is an example of a long exposure. This is Carmel Beach. Now, in a bright light environment, you tend to find that if you leave the camera on auto, it's going to give you a fairly fast shutter speed because it wants to avoid camera shake and it's trying to record the light that is there. But if you want to get something a bit more creative, a bit more visually intriguing, a bit more visually interesting, then a long exposure gives you that power. You can see how we can now capture the motion of the receding wave and the crashing wave coming in. Long exposure, in this case, is probably, this is around about half a second to a second exposure. Next up, waterfalls, another great usage of long exposure. In this case, this is a 30-second exposure. Now, to get these super long exposures requires phones to give you manual control, and the LG V10 gives us exposure control all the way down to 30 seconds. But there's a little trick that we need to use because it's an f1.8 lens, and that means that it lets in an awful lot of light. Okay, so when you've got a lot of light coming in, achieving that slow shutter speed is quite challenging. And what I did in this case, and what I do whenever I use long exposure, is like the ND grad filters I told you about before, I use a solid ND filter. So this doesn't have the gradation with the dark top half and the clear bottom half. It's just solidly dark. Think of it a bit like welding glass. And it comes in different strengths to allow you to cut out more or less light. So beyond waterfalls, here's an example of a harbour in Israel. And here I've used the long exposure to help bring out the reflection. If we have a fast shutter speed here, you'd see all the ripples of the waves on the water. You wouldn't be able to see the reflection very clearly. It wouldn't have that sense of calm to it. By using a long exposure, it brings out, yes, the boats have got a bit blurry, but it brings out more of that reflection and creates a more dreamy, more relaxed, more calming style image. So they're your long exposures. If you want to get long exposures, you'll be able to get so far by using the shutter speed control. But if you want to go further, you're going to have to put something in front of the lens. Now, I'm not suggesting you all go out and buy ND filters. But one thing you can do is, if you have a pair of sunglasses, try holding your sunglasses in front of the lens. You know, sunglasses are quite large and the lens is quite small. Hold it in front. That's one good way of cutting out some of the light to achieve these slower shutter speed, long exposure, dreamy images. Okay, some big no-nos, some things not to do with your mobile phone, and I have two key ones. Now, if you have a traditional camera, a DSLR, I'm guessing that you probably keep your lenses pretty clean. And yet the state of lenses that I've seen on mobile phones is scary. You can see here a great big thumbprint right across the lens. Now, your mobile phone lives in pretty difficult places. It's in your pocket, it's in your jacket, it's in the desk drawer with pens and coins and keys, and it's likely to get scratched. It's likely to get smeared. It's likely to get thumbprints and fingerprints, or if you put it in your mouth to hold your phone while you fish your keys out your bag, it's going to get your lip print. All of that is going to degrade your image quality. So before you start taking pictures, just remember to give the lens a little bit of a wipe. Clean it off, use your t-shirt, your shirt, your jumper, whatever it is. Just keep that lens as clean as you possibly can. Otherwise, you're going to find it's going to adversely affect your image quality. You're going to end up with haze, and it's going to be not so pleasant to look at. The next one, of course, beyond cleaning your lens, the next one is the built-in flash. Okay, now all mobile phone manufacturers, all mobile phones have some kind of built-in flash. It's very useful if you've dropped your keys and you need to find them in the dark. It is not best used when you're taking pictures. It's a very small light source. It's very close to the lens. It's very bright and very harsh. And you've probably all experienced that if you've taken a picture of someone with that, A, the range isn't very good. It only really lights things up that are about a meter away. And B, anyone you photographed looking like that tends to look like a rabbit in headlights. So avoid it. If you want to use the built-in flash, take your friend's phone and use their light as a torch somewhere off to one side. That way you're going to get shadows in a much nicer place, the image is going to look a lot better, and it's not going to be all that harsh, horrible lighting. So thank you very much, camera manufacturers, for the built-in flash, but I don't recommend you use it most of the time. Okay, selfies and groupies. Now, you'll notice there's not too many pictures of me. I don't tend to shoot many selfies, but as I said at the start, we couldn't have a talk about mobile phones without talking about selfies. And indeed, the LG V10 has two lenses. One not being enough, we have the lens for selfie, so when you want to take a picture of just yourself, and we have a groupie lens, ability to get basically a wider angle view. So what you want to do is use the groupie if you're trying to take a picture of a group, and use the selfie when you're taking a picture of yourself. Now that sounds very obvious, and like I'm, teaching you how to put a nail into a plank of wood. The other thing you can do with the groupie lens, because it's a wide angle lens, is pictures of yourself, but a bit further out if you want to show more of yourself in the environment. Show more of the amazing place where you're taking this selfie. Now, in this case, more of your hand covering the lens while you accidentally take a selfie whilst trying to turn the phone off. Yes, happy accidents do happen to all of us when we're taking pictures. This one actually turned out reasonably well. The other thing, we talked about light earlier on, so the other thing to think about when you're taking a selfie, obviously no one wants to take a selfie that makes themselves look terrible, so think about where the light's coming from. Don't just pull your camera out and take a picture. If you want to take your selfie from something that would give kids nightmares to something that you might actually want to show to other people, think about the light. Don't stand directly under a light above you. Look for, is the light coming in from the side? Is it shining directly onto your face? Is it behind you? And just turn yourself around with the light and see how it changes the picture. And at some point you'll go, oh, actually, yeah, okay, that's probably my best side. That's my best angle. That's where I should be having the light from to take my selfies. And then you can try and recreate it. Okay, some tips, some other tips beyond the ones we've already gone through. So the first one is take control. I said earlier on that your camera is essentially dumb. It doesn't know what you want to achieve. It doesn't know, as I said, the difference between shadows and highlights. It doesn't know that you want a slow shutter speed or a fast shutter speed. If your camera gives you the ability to have manual control of your shutter speed and your ISO, take it, grab it with both hands and run with it, because it will improve your pictures. It will slow you down. It'll stop you doing point and shoot. It will make you more considered in your picture taking. Digital cameras also give us a digital zoom. Most cameras do. Most mobile phone cameras give us some kind of ability to pinch to zoom. It's generally not very good. You've probably found this out for yourself. All it does is crop the image. So it doesn't magically make the lens any longer. It just crops the middle out. It always ends up looking grainy. You're reducing and reducing and reducing the resolution. If you just want low resolution to post on social media, by all means, zoom in. But you're better off taking a picture at the full wide and cropping it later. I mean, at the end of the day, you're just achieving the same as you would have done if you'd zoomed at the time. But at least you have more control, and you've also still got the wide version. So try and avoid the digital zoom wherever possible. If you are going to use it, don't go zooming into the maximum zoom. That's just a recipe for disaster. Try and be gentle with it. I talked about filters. What I want to say here is that you should really treat your mobile phone like it's a traditional camera. It is capable of getting fantastic results, stunning pictures, as hopefully you've seen so far, but not if you treat it like a point and snappy camera. You've got to actually think more about what you're trying to do. Here you can see a traditional DSLR camera mounted on a tripod with some filters, and mounted on top of that is a mobile phone on a tripod with some filters, and the picture on the right is the resulting image taken with a mobile phone. Now, if you can do that with a mobile phone, why wouldn't you take more control? Why wouldn't you take more time? If you can get great images, it's really nice to be able to whip out a phone and in a couple of seconds grab a really nice picture. It's way better than carrying the 20+ kilos of camera kit that I normally hike around with, and is the reason I have had a bad back. A mobile phone slips in a pocket, it's ready at a moment's notice. So take your time, think about it as if it is a traditional camera. Don't say, oh, it's just my mobile, I'm just going to grab a couple of snaps. Think about it, be more considered, take your time. Now, for those of you that go to cold places, a little tip, frostbite is no fun. If it's really cold, here, this is Norway, it was about -15. Getting your fingers out at that temperature is not to be recommended. So here, yes, we can get those gloves that give us the control with the touchpads, but I've never found them to be that great in terms of giving you control over the small icons on a screen. Here I'm using a stylus. I simply took a stylus, connected it to a retractable leash and stuck it on my bag, and that way, even when it's really cold, I'm able to control the phone and get or take pictures without getting frostbite, without getting my hands out. So those of you that go skiing, this is a great little tip. Take your stylus, attach it to your ski pass holder, and you'll find that you've got much more control over your phone. In fact, you can use a touch screen even at the extremes of the temperature. Now we're rapidly running out of time. I think it's pretty much time for questions and answers. So thank you very much. That seems to have gone incredibly quickly from my point of view. Thank you very much for your attendance, for being on the line. We'll have Q&A now. If you don't get your question answered, get in touch through the social media things below.
Awesome.
Over to you, Si.
Hey, thank you so much, David. That was really, I actually thought that went really quick, but a lot of good insights there. But I know it's time for Q&A right now. So it's we have about 15 minutes for Q&A, so just keep dropping your questions in. This is a hot topic. So I already have so many questions, so I'm going to start taking them in the order received. But please put in more questions, and I'll keep asking them to Dave, and he will reply. So there's a few questions here. I'm going to combine them, David. These are on ND filters. I know we spoke about ND filters. So do you, and you spoke about using your, sunglasses maybe as a filter. So do you have any other hardware filters as recommendations, or also software filters? Like, are there any apps out there that could be, used as ND filters? So anything on that topic?
Okay. So from a hardware point of view, there are many manufacturers that make ND filters. I tend to use them from a manufacturer called Lee Filters. They're very good, but as I say, there are many others, Kokin and Hightech. From a software point of view, yes, most apps will give you some kind of software filter ability. Particularly if you're looking at in RAW, you can always find a way of darkening a sky down in software. My personal preference is to try and get things as right in camera as possible, though, because even if you're then going to adjust it afterwards, you're going to carry out editing. If you've got a better starting point, you end up with a better end point. If you're trying to do everything on the computer, it sometimes just doesn't end up giving you the best result. That's a personal viewpoint. Now, in terms of apps of the phone, I mentioned Adobe Lightroom for Android. That's very good if you're editing RAW files. There are any number of other apps, depending on what platform you're on. Things like or things like Snapseed, for example, is another popular app out there that will give you some ability to not necessarily put an ND filter on, but do something similar to it.
Awesome. So for the people on the presentation yet, this is getting recorded. So in case you're taking notes, you can obviously go back to the video, which we will send to you sooner, a YouTube link, so you can go back there to just, get notes again. So don't have to worry about taking all the notes right now. Okay, so this has always been a problem for me as well, David, and how do you take the best pictures in the low light? And I know it is a lot more evident when you're taking photos on your mobile phone that low light is a big problem. So there's night modes and stuff, but what is your recommendation on that? No shaky pictures in low light.
No shaky pictures in low light. If you want to avoid shake, the simple thing to do is put the camera on a tripod. Find some way of stabilizing the camera. It may be that you have a tripod, it may be you don't. On a wall, lean it up against a glass, lean yourself against a signpost or a wall or a tree. Find some way of stabilizing the camera. That way you can use the longer exposures. And if you can get the longer exposure, that is always preferable to turning up the ISO. Unless, of course, you've got a moving subject. So long exposure is clearly not going to work if you're trying to photograph your children in low light. In that situation, obviously the best thing you can do actually is just turn up the ISO. You're going to have to accept that you are going to get some image noise, but at least it's the lesser of two evils. Do you want a blurry picture, or do you want a picture that's sharp, albeit it has some noise in it?
All right, perfect. The next one's from Bill. I know we spoke about RAW files and shooting on RAW. So what mobile phones, you don't have to give me the total list, but maybe the top of the head, what are the top phones that have RAW, and how do you choose the setting? Do you just go into the settings and choose select RAW?
So obviously the LG V10 has RAW, as does the new G5, and in fact the G4, and what else is there? It's not something we've seen on iOS yet, particularly. Certainly not as an embedded solution from the iOS side, although I think there might be some third-party apps that give you that ability. I think one of the HTCs, maybe the One M9 is able to shoot RAW. Now, from an LG point of view, if you want to get to RAW, it's simply a case of switching the camera to manual. So in the settings you choose manual, and then there's an ability to, instead of just it'll say JPEG on the left hand side, instead of just selecting JPEG, you tap that and you'll get JPEG and RAW, and as I explained, all the benefits that RAW files bring with them.
Awesome, I didn't even know that. Okay, this is really good. The next one's from Joanne. What picture size do you recommend as a default setting? Now there's two things, right? We want to save the memory, but we also want to get the best sized photos in case you want to edit it later on the PC. So what is the best setting as a default you choose?
My view on this, thanks for the question, Joanne, my view on this is always that actually you want to capture as high a resolution as possible. If you've got a camera that can shoot 10, 12, 16, 18, 20 megapixels, I've never understood why people would shoot less than that. Why have a camera that can do 16 megapixels, for example, and then shoot it at 8 megapixels? You may as well capture everything and throw it away if you don't want it later, rather than capturing it small and then going, oh, that was a great picture, and I would love to make a print of that for someone, or someone says, oh, I'd love a print of that, but you've only got a low resolution. At the end of the day, I know we're on this is a SanDisk webinar, so I'm going to say that memory is cheap. Memory is indeed cheap, and it's not difficult to download pictures. So just accept the fact that yes, you're going to fill your phone up a little bit quicker. Maybe if you're on an Android device, you can make use of things like a micro SD card. We've seen just at Mobile World Congress last week that some of the phones that had got rid of micro SD card slots have brought them back because they've realized how useful they are. So I'd say, to answer the question succinctly, always shoot at the highest resolution possible. Shoot at the maximum file size you can, and then downsize it later on to suit whatever you might want to do with the picture.
Cool. All right, I have two questions from John and Fred and back-to-back about exposure. So what is the best way to get a long exposure during daylight hours and bright surroundings? And then to follow up that, do you shoot long exposure shots handheld? So
Okay, so the best way to get long exposure in daylight, I think I said that obviously, we've basically got a fixed aperture. That's all we have on mobile phones. We can't close the aperture down to f16, 18, 22 to let in less light. We're stuck with the wide aperture. So the only real way to do that is to put something in between the scene and the lens. So that's where your ND filters come in. Your a solid ND. As I said, you can use your sunglasses. You could use welding glass if you wanted to, if you could get your hands on some of that. Basically anything that's going to make the light coming into the camera darker. It's the only real option we've got to try and get those longer exposures. And to answer the second part of that question, mobile phones have reasonable image stabilization, but I wouldn't even shoot, even on a traditional camera, I wouldn't shoot a long exposure handheld. It's just a recipe for blurry pictures. And frankly, no one really wants blurry pictures, so wherever possible, I think, as I said in answer to the last question, try and find some way of stabilizing the camera. A tripod, be it a full-size tripod, be it a small tripod, be it a monopod, be it bracing it against the wall, get a glass, prop it up against a glass, prop it up against anything really, prop yourself up, and maybe don't drink too much alcohol the night before just to keep your hands as stable as possible. So yes, I wouldn't shoot long exposures handheld wherever I could avoid it.
All right, perfect. So there's one, quickly about the stylus. We spoke about that. That's a really good tip. Just letting it go when you just take the photo and just sort of retracts back to your bag is pretty cool. I wasn't thinking about that. So what kind of stylus do you recommend? And how do you just tag it onto your badge or whatever you said? Does it have like a little, yeah.
Well, any kind of stylus will work. I went online and I just ordered a cheap stylus. I think on I don't know if am I allowed to mention Amazon? On Amazon, I found a nice cheap stylus. Trying to be brand agnostic here. I found a really cheap stylus. It was like $10. And all I did was I just gaffer taped it, duct taped it to a retractable keychain, and then clipped the retractable keychain onto my jacket, and then whenever I wanted the stylus, I just kind of pulled it out and started controlling the phone, and then
cool.
Let go. It meant that I didn't drop it in the snow and lose it.
All right, perfect. So I know we spoke about photo editing apps, but that's important again. So I just like to, there's a question about any recommendations of photo editing apps, so that we just have it on record again. What are the top ones you can
So photo editing apps, obviously, Adobe are the big player on a computer. They are making big moves in the mobile space as well. So we've got Adobe Lightroom for Android. There's also Adobe Photoshop for mobile. We've got apps like Enlight and Snapseed. These are all really good editing apps that give you a lot of control. From a RAW point of view, though, there are very few. So at the moment, our RAW is pretty much limited to Adobe Lightroom for Android at the moment, but I'm expecting that to change as RAW becomes more prevalent across more mobile devices.
Awesome. Wow, we have so many questions. This is like rapid fire. I don't even have the time to read the full question for you. I am getting these come in. So the next one's from Russell. Any tips on portrait shots? One or two folks in the frame. I know we spoke about the rule of thirds. How does this work for portrait shots with maybe two or more people in the frame?
Okay, so if you've got one person in the frame, then obviously it's a bit easier to control or to compose around your guideline of thirds. Try and put the eyes somewhere on the upper third. Don't leave too much space above people's heads. If you've got more than one person in the frame, then try and put one of the heads. You're obviously going to be shooting a bit of a wider shot. Try and put a head somewhere on one of the thirds. That way, that they will have a bit more dominance. Obviously, if you're at a wedding, make sure that's the bride. Because the bride is obviously the most dominant thing at a wedding. But yeah, if you've got more than one person, try and put at least one of the people somewhere on that intersecting third. The big mistake I find people make with portraits is they typically leave way too much space above the top of someone's head. It's just a whole bundle of wasted pixels. They're doing nothing in the frame. So make sure you kind of angle yourself down. And in fact, just while we're talking about photographing people, if it's your children, don't photograph them from your standing height. Please get down to their level, crouch down, get down on your hands and knees, shoot at their eye level. You'll get far more intimate pictures, far more interesting portraits.
All right, perfect. So we spoke about applications now. I know there's a few questions about shooting RAW, shooting ISO. So all these controls, I'm just, want to double check it. All these controls are still available just from the phone, right? We don't have to get apps as such. They're all default on a lot of
So
phones these days.
it very much depends on the phone. The more advanced phones, so phones like the LG V10, as I said, the first SanDisk phone, one of the things that it's giving us is these manual controls. Depending on what phone you're on, you may or may not have manual controls. If you don't, then there are apps that will give you manual controls or will give you some kind of level of manual control. And in fact, that's true whether you're on Android or iOS. Some of the apps that you'll find will give you at least shutter speed control or a level of shutter speed control, even if they don't give you a full 30 seconds like the V10 does.
Cool. All right, the next one's from Lana. I know we didn't speak about lenses as such, as accessories. So what accessory lenses do you recommend for phone photography, if any, such as macro, zoom, etc.? I know we've seen something called an Holoclip out there for a selfie lens, or would you recommend anything? Or just use the phone's default?
Absolutely. I mean, there are a lot of solutions. Holoclip is one of the more well-known ones. I've used Holoclip. They do work very well. Depending on how far you want to go, there are even things. I have a device called a Beast Grip, which is like a cage to put the phone in, and it actually allows me to mount traditional camera lenses, like any Canon EOS mount lens onto the phone to give a full range of lenses. Now, does it work brilliantly? It's a bit of a juggling act. In terms of third-party lenses, there are a lot out there. What I would say is stay away from the really cheap ones. If they're really cheap for a reason. And it's probably because their image quality is not that great. So try and stay away from the cheap ones. Look at the more well-known brands, the ones that have been around for a while. Yes, as I say, Holoclip are very good. The difficulty you tend to find is that they are designed for a particular phone, and obviously iOS, Apple was sort of the first area where we started seeing, it was the most popular camera for a while. So there tends to be more for Apple devices than there are for Android devices, but that doesn't mean you can't get them for Android devices. So have a look around. By all means, use them. I tend to try and avoid the really wide-angle ones because, the fisheye ones tend to be a bit gimmicky. But anything that makes the lens a little bit longer, so a slightly more telephoto one, can be quite nice because it gives you something you can't otherwise do with the phone.
Perfect. So go cheap on the stylus, not on the lens, obviously. All right.
Exactly.
All right. The next one's from Vincent. What about white balance settings and the preset white balance settings? How do you work with that? And what's the best way to change those?
Great question. If you've got white balance settings, by all means use it. Cameras, auto white balance, mobile phones, auto white balance is okay. Sometimes it does really well, but you tend to find in indoors, say tungsten lighting, for example, that it doesn't work so well. So by all means, use one of the presets. So you'll probably find most phones will give you, if they give you control of white balance, you'll have daylight, shade, cloudy, tungsten, fluorescent, and probably a custom white balance. Obviously, the ultimate end is to use a custom white balance, but it's usually a bit slow going. So pick one of the presets if you're finding it's not going to be accurate. But obviously, at the time because you can see on the screen what it's going to look like. So yes, use one of the presets. In daylight, auto white balance will work well. Obviously, the power of RAW means that you can change your white balance afterwards. If you've got the ability to shoot RAW, white balance is one of those things that you can adjust later on in processing without degrading the image quality.
All right, thank you. So I know we're running out of time, but we'll take one last one. And we spoke a lot about Android phones and the settings today. What's the advice for iPhone and a few apps on the top of your mind for the best photography there?
So from an iPhone point of view, we've got quite a few apps from an editing point of view. I mentioned Enlight. From a camera capture point of view, Depending on what you're trying to achieve, I find that Camera Plus is quite nice. It's quite a good app, gives you quite a good bit of control. If you're more interested in video, and video is something we might, there's discussions about doing a video webinar for Video Mobile at some point, then Filmic Pro is very good on an iPhone. If you're looking to get better HDR than you can get in the camera's own app, then have a look at Pro HDR. They're probably the most common ones from an iPhone or iOS, and obviously there is Lightroom for iOS as well. And Lightroom for iOS actually has its own camera app as well, as it does in Android, so that's quite a good place to start too.
All right, perfect. I know for all the attendees out there, would really thank you. I mean, there's a lot more questions. I know they're just still coming in, but you can see David's Facebook profile there on the last slide. Definitely hit up David on his social spaces. If you're following SanDisk on our emails, we'll be sending you tips again on mobile photography, different parts. Even the video of this presentation will be sent out, so you can share with your friends. It'll be a YouTube link. So again, I want to thank everyone. I want to thank our partner, LG, for the great support on this webinar. David, thanks to you too. This was really good. I enjoyed it. I hope our audience did, and you're a great presenter.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you enjoyed it, Sai. As I say, I echo your thoughts. I hope everyone else did. As you said, if anyone's got questions that we didn't get round to, feel free to hit me up on Facebook. Come follow me, Facebook, Instagram. Come to my website, send me an email. I will do my best. If there's a flood of emails, it might take me a bit of time to get through them, but I will do my best to go through them and answer all your questions, whatever you didn't get to ask now. So thank you very much for your attendance.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.